Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live during the deadliest pandemic in history? This question takes us back to the 14th century when Europe was in the grips of the Black Death, the most lethal pandemic known to mankind. Originating in Asia, this devastating disease was carried along the Silk Road, finally making its ominous debut in Europe in the early 1340s. Unbeknownst to the people of the time, a deadly bacterium known as Yersinia pestis had arrived on their shores, ready to unleash havoc. The medieval towns with their narrow streets and crowded markets were the perfect breeding grounds for this silent killer. The bustling markets and ports, teeming with people and goods from far-flung corners of the world, played a significant role in the rapid spread of the plague. But the true culprits, the ones who carried the deadly bacteria, were much smaller in size. Fleas, tiny insects that thrived amidst squalor, were the primary carriers of the bacterium. These fleas found a perfect host in the black rats that infested the towns and cities. As these rats scurried through the streets, into homes and onto ships, the fleas bit and infected humans, spreading the plague far and wide. People were mystified and terrified by the speed of the disease's spread. One day a person would be perfectly healthy, and the next they would be bedridden with fever, chills, and painful swellings known as buboes, from which the bubonic plague derives its name. The Black Death was a silent invader, creeping into the lives of the unsuspecting populace. It was a shadowy figure that did not discriminate, striking down the rich and the poor, the young and the old with equal ferocity. It was a grim reaper that would go on to change the course of history forever. Imagine a disease so deadly it could wipe out entire towns in a matter of weeks. The Black Death, a name which sent chills down the spine of every 14th century European, was such a disease. Its symptoms were horrifying: swollen lymph nodes, which often grew to the size of a small egg and were accompanied by acute fever, severe muscle ache, and an overwhelming fatigue. To add to the horror, it was not unusual for the infected to cough up blood, a sure sign of impending doom. The bubonic plague, as it was scientifically known, was no respecter of persons. It ravaged the homes of the rich and poor alike, tearing families apart, and leaving in its wake a trail of death and desolation. At its peak, the Black Death was claiming lives so rapidly that the living could hardly keep up with burying the dead. Whole families were wiped out, and entire neighborhoods were abandoned, haunted by the eerie silence of death. But the impact of the Black Death was not limited to the physical alone. The psychological toll it took on the survivors was equally devastating. Fear became the order of the day. People lived in constant dread of falling ill, and the sight of a rat, the plague's infamous carrier, was enough to send a shiver down the spine of the bravest knight. Paranoia was rampant. Not knowing how else to explain or combat the disease, many turned to superstition, blaming it on the wrath of God, or worse, accusing innocent individuals of witchcraft. The Black Death was not just a disease, it was a harbinger of death and despair. It was a grim reaper that visited every home, every castle, every monastery, and every marketplace, leaving no stone unturned. It was a dark shadow that, once it fell upon you, there was little hope of escape. But as we'll see in the subsequent scenes, it was also a catalyst for profound social, religious, and scientific changes. We continue our journey into the shadows of death in our next scene. Could you imagine being accused of causing a deadly pandemic? In the 14th century, during the era of the Black Death, this was not merely a thought experiment. As the pandemic ravaged through communities, fear and panic began to grip society, leading to social unrest and scapegoating. In the face of such terror, people sought someone to blame for their suffering. Often those targeted were society's most vulnerable: the elderly, the poor, and particularly women who were accused of witchcraft. Widespread hysteria led to numerous witch trials, with accused individuals held responsible for the plague. These unfortunate souls were believed to have conspired with the devil to bring about the Black Death, a charge that often led to execution by burning at the stake. The atmosphere of fear and paranoia gave birth to violence, with riots and pogroms becoming a terrifyingly common sight. In Strasbourg, for instance, in the February of 1349, several hundred Jews were burnt alive, accused of poisoning wells and causing the plague. This scapegoating and the resulting violence ripped communities apart, adding a layer of human-inflicted horror to the already grim reality of the pandemic. Religious institutions, too, played a significant role during the Black Death. The Church, with its promise of spiritual salvation, found itself both a source of comfort and a target of blame. Clergy members, who often served as caregivers to the sick, were especially vulnerable to the disease. The high mortality rate among the clergy led to a shortage of experienced religious leaders, further destabilizing an already frightened society. Ironically, the Church also contributed to the spread of the disease. Believing the plague to be a divine punishment, they organized processions and mass confessions, inadvertently providing the perfect conditions for the bacteria to thrive. In times of crisis, fear can often lead to irrational actions and devastating consequences. The social and religious repercussions of the Black Death serve as a stark reminder of this, highlighting the importance of understanding and empathy in the face of fear. Opening: what would you do if you were a nobleman during the time of the Black Death? Imagine for a moment that you're in the heart of the 14th century. The Black Death, this invisible monster, is rapidly consuming your kingdom. As a noble, you're tasked with making decisions that could mean life or death for your subjects. The first measure against the plague was quarantine, originating from the Italian words quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. This practice aimed to isolate the infected, cutting off the disease's lifeline. Ships coming into port were not allowed to disembark their passengers or goods for 40 days. This helped to reduce the spread of the plague, but it was far from a perfect solution. Alongside quarantine, restrictions were put in place. Public gatherings, a breeding ground for the disease, were limited. Churches, taverns, and markets were closed. Streets were cleaned, and the sick were moved to pest houses, makeshift hospitals for plague victims. But the Black Death was not just a physical affliction, it was a psychological tormentor, breeding fear and paranoia. To ease the public's fear, the nobles turned to the scapegoat strategy. They blamed the Jews, beggars, lepers, even cats and dogs for the spread of the plague. Some were expelled from cities, others were brutally executed, measures that were fueled by fear rather than reason. And then there were the flagellants, groups of people who believed that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. They marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance. Some nobles allowed this, thinking it might appease God's wrath. In the face of the Black Death, the nobility and authorities of the time did what they could, using the limited knowledge and resources they had. They were fighting an enemy they barely understood, an enemy that was decimating their world, closing. Even the mightiest were powerless against the relentless advance of the Black Death. Their efforts, though valiant, were like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a shield, but they laid the groundwork for public health measures that we still use today. How would society rebuild after losing millions to a deadly disease? In the wake of the Black Death, Europe found itself in a state of profound transformation. The sheer magnitude of the devastation left the survivors in a world that was forever altered, a stark reminder of the fragility of human life. Economically, the pandemic had a profound and lasting impact. As the plague decimated the population, labor became scarce. The shortage of workers led to wage increases for the surviving laborers, while the declining population meant there was less need for food and goods, leading to a drop in prices. This shift in economic dynamics upset the feudal system that had long defined Europe and paved the way for a transition towards a more modern economic structure. Socially, the Black Death shifted the balance of power. With the death toll indiscriminate of class or wealth, aristocracy was not spared. This leveled societal hierarchies and gave rise to the middle class. Culturally, the pandemic left a deep imprint on the collective psyche. Art and literature took a dark turn, reflecting the pervasive sense of doom and mortality. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular motif, symbolizing the universality of death regardless of one's social status. But perhaps the most profound change was religious. The Black Death shook the faith of many. The inability of the Church to provide solace or prevent the catastrophe led to disillusionment and fostered skepticism. This disillusionment, coupled with the rise of the middle class, set the stage for the Protestant Reformation, a seismic shift in the religious landscape of Europe. The Black Death left an indelible mark on history, a dark shadow that continues to loom over humanity to this day. This was a time of profound change, a turning point that marked the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the modern era. As we look back, we are reminded of our resilience in the face of adversity, of our ability to adapt and persevere, to rebuild and move forward.